I will also start to express my gratitude to the city of Porto for inviting me for this event. I've never been to Porto before, and I surely will try to come here again. It's a very nice city with many qualities. I'll start unofficially, but we can just take this one a little bit forward. I have an answer, something for Federico, who mentioned, I think he'll be happy about this. And this is not part of my talk, it's just a little information for Federico. We talked about that the number of cars were racing, and I see that as a major problem worldwide. But I talked with the mayor of Copenhagen, and she gave me an interesting new information. In a new city district of Copenhagen, they have said there's no parking on the streets. If you park on the streets, you can be there 3 hours, then you must go. Everybody has to park in a parking structure. And the parking structure is 200 meters down the road. And then she told me that in Copenhagen, every third household have a car. But in this district, where you have to walk 200 meters to the car, and you have to pay the price for having a car in a city, that is the price of constructing a parking garage. So on top of your rent in the house, you pay for the parking. And then suddenly only 10% of the households need a car. So if it's a little bit complicated and a little bit expensive, maybe many people will think a little bit extra. But also in this area, there is a good metro, and it's in bicycle distance from center of Copenhagen. But only 10% of the households have one car. But that's not what I'm going to tell about today. I'll tell about that cities can change, and architecture and urban design can indeed assist cities in change. I've seen it very frequently, and I'll tell you a little bit about this. We are going to talk about human-centered urbanism. And this one about there are some cities which get a little bit better every day, and then there are some cities which get a little bit worse every day. And we have definitely two directions in city planning. One, a very technocratic direction, building roads and high-rise and skyscrapers and glass and steel. Another one taking much more care of the people in the city. And I'll tell you a little bit about this story. First, I will show this picture. It's my granddaughter. And she's just learned to walk. And that's the biggest day in every person's life, when instead of crawling, you come up and realize, I can walk. The mother will go to the phone and phone the grandmother and say, she can walk, she can walk. And that's a great day, because Homo sapiens is a walking animal. And we have the senses, which is good for a walking animal, and we have the movements we have developed over years, millions of years. And also this creature is very interested in other people. That is our customer. And that is the same in Greenland and in Tasmania and in Japan and in California. It's the same all over the world, Homo sapiens, a walking creature. We had, earlier on, 100 years ago, we had the good old days. And they lasted from way back until 1933, circa. And the interesting thing about the good old days were that all the cities were made by people for people. And that it was the Homo sapiens, as we know him or her, they were made for. The streets were in human dimensions, and there were many details for you can look at, and it was a pleasure to walk and to see the architecture in these cities. good old days, built by people and built for this walking creature, Homo sapiens. If we go to the historic cities, interestingly, we can find that all cities in the world were built with two building blocks. That was the street and the square. The street was a linear space connecting things, and that was dictated by the feet. So you have a path, and along the path you have sheds, and after a while the sheds become bigger, and after a while the sheds become houses, and then you have a street. Walking, the linear space, the space for moving. The other element we have in all the cities are the space for experiencing, and that is dictated by the eye. The human eye can see other people 100 meters away, and no good square is bigger than 100 meters. Then you can see everything happening, and you can recognize people in the other end of the square. If it's bigger, it's not good. You can recognize the 100 meters from all the football fields. You can never sell a ticket for a football match if you're more than 100 meters away, because then you cannot see if it's the red or the yellow players who have the ball. So 100 meters, and that limits the size of stadiums all over the world. They're all the same size. So we had these two elements. But then in 1933 there was an ideological earthquake, a complete turning upside down of everything mankind had done throughout history. And that was not United Nations, that was not existing, or European Union, that were not existing. It was the architects themselves who met in Athens under the guidance of Corbusier, and they decided that everything built until now was old-fashioned and redundant and should be thrown out, and from now on we have a complete new situation. We are not building for Homo sapiens anymore, now we are building for modern man, and modern man should have a very rational life, running from his work to his flat, and be healthy. And then they also came up with a brilliant idea. From now on, we almost all the time we must divide the functions. You live here, you can recreate here, you can work here, you can go to university here. Never put functions together. That was the idea of modernism, and that was distributed very efficiently. Come on. Before modernism, all the cities were made of streets and squares, and everything in the cities happened in streets and squares. All the life of the cities was carried out in the public spaces. So the whole focus of city were public spaces. Wonder why this is not working. Here we are. In all the old cities, we can remember all the streets and squares, all the names of the streets and squares, but we can only recall three buildings. That's the King's Castle and the Town Hall and the Cathedral. All the rest of the buildings, they are anonymous buildings making the streets of squares, which are the city. This is Copenhagen, and every old city is like this one. And we can see a map like this one by Nolli, made in 1748. He was asked to show Rome, and what he showed in this plan was all the publicly accessible spaces. So Rome is a system of public spaces. You cannot see a single of the famous buildings in Rome. They were not important, the spaces were. Then, in the modern cities, it was another story. Now the focus was not on building spaces for people, the focus moved to making objects and objects of single functions, and whatever was not built upon was not a space, it was a leftover space. And so suddenly the whole city was made up of objects. The architects were very happy about this because it is somewhat difficult to make a space, a square, a street. It's much easier to make a funny shape, and it's also much easier to have a funny shape shown in an architectural magazine. And then the architects, of course, ever since the objects were the purpose of architecture, the architects, they competed on making funny shapes. And they look very much like the perfume bottles in my wife's corner. And because it's the same purpose, these also, all of them have offices, and every architect is sitting there, how can I make it look different from the other? And they found out all these funny shapes. So in the modern cities like Dubai and Doha and whatever, you can find no spaces for people because there are none. And you can find, what you can find are funny looking objects. That is a complete departure from the way we used to do it. And that is, of course, a very serious departure. The result of this movement from the good old days to the modernistic city was that the concern for people and social life and social spaces were completely forgotten. Goodbye. And you could walk endlessly in Brasilia on these roads there, and you knew for sure that it would not be more interesting 1 kilometer further on. No, it's not so good. No. Another result of this was a goodbye to the knowledge of human scale. In the old days, we built everything for people. In the modern times, we started to build objects and were not interested in the spaces. The spaces were leftover space, and people were left out in the leftover space. That's about the worst place you can be. Another thing about this change from good old days to modernism was that the precondition for doing this is, of course, if you spread the functions, you must have mobility so you get from one to the other. And ever since the 30s, we have been so obsessed with organizing mobility that we have forgotten almost everything about A and B, and we only thought about getting from A to B. Mobility was introduced, and the mobility, of course, the car industry was ready to come along with smart mobility. They got the idea that if every one of us got 1 ton of steel and 4 rubber wheels, we will have mobility worldwide. And that was the basic idea 125 years ago by Henry Ford. It's still the idea today. The technology has not changed a bit. It's only that the motor is now electric, maybe. There was no big invasion of motor cars before the Second World War. But in 1960, when we started to rebuild the cities and we had money again, there was an economic upturn, then suddenly we had the car invasion, and it was very, very rapid and very, very bad. All the old cities were completely filled with cars right away, and people were pushed out of the public spaces, or pushed at least over to the sides. And in the new districts and in the third world, the cars became completely dominant. And gradually, the quality for people in the cities deteriorated. Actually, it went very fast, and it is from one end of the world to the other. You saw scenes like this one. And of course, when we had this new mobility mode, the car, we started to make dedicated infrastructure so we can move around with 100 kilometers an hour all the time. And then we started to make districts which were completely dependent on having one or two of these new mobility wonders. Of course, it's not a very good place to go for a walk with your dog, and you need to have a car to be in contact with anything, and that is the single-family house area, which of course became very dominant, first in America, then in many other places. With the car also came a new scale. The old days we have 5 km/h scale, built for Homo sapiens, small spaces, small signals. You can see and hear people, and you can see details in the buildings. But with the car came the higher speed, and you have now the whole world in 60 km/h architecture. Wide streets and enormous signs, so you can see them while you are rushing past. You cannot see any people with that speed, and you cannot see any details with that speed, so don't make any details in that scale. That is waste of time. So all the fine details of the old cities were gone with the introduction of the 60 km/h scale. If you are in doubt of how it looked like, you can just take a little trip to Dubai and look out of the window. Here you can see mobility being dominant. You can see the high-rise funny buildings, and you can see the leftover space. They even are so much leftover that they don't know what to do with them, so they paint them green or something like that. Have a good life. What was known about quality for people at the time when the modernism really started in a big way and the car invasion started? Virtually nothing was known. The first then started, of course, a counter movement against this very technocratic world dominated by functionalistic architecture and modernist and automobile crazy people. And the first voice we heard was Jane Jacobs sitting over in Greenwich Village, where she battled with Robert Moses, the traffic engineer, who said that the only way to save Manhattan and make a good city is to take all the old useless stuff away and build a number of freeways across Manhattan and make high-rise along the freeways. Then we can save Manhattan. And the worst of all these old areas was, of course, Greenwich Village, where Jane Jacobs was sitting. And she raised all the neighbors, and she did a fantastic campaign against this new plan, and they actually won, and the plan was scratched. And you can still, today when you go to New York, you go to Greenwich Village, to Tribeca, to Soho, all the nice places in New York, they were about to be taken away. Jane Jacobs changed that. And she wrote this fantastic book, which is more or less the Bible of urban design. And she said in this one, if the modernists and the motorists are to plan the future cities, they will not be great cities, they will be dead cities. Jane Jacobs. Story of my own life. I graduated as an architect in 1960, and I was trained in School of Architecture during the 50s. And what did we do in the 50s in School of Architecture? We spent 5 years bent over models. We always had to go up in about 5 kilometers here, and then you moved around with the objects. And then suddenly you said, this is a nice city. And that was the way we did city planning in School of Architecture in the 60s. And here you can see one of our famous professors. He was famous for saying that a good housing area is something which looks smart from a freeway. And here he has built something which looks good from the freeway in Sweden, and they have built it, and it's now a problem area. I think it was the worst time ever for city planning. But I got this education, and we were very much inflamed by all these brave new ideas. We went 3 times a day towards Brasilia, which was the first modernistic city. And, sorry about this one. And I went out of school to do all these wonderful things which I've just learned in school was what people was expecting architects to do. And then I married a psychologist. And then in our house came a number of young architects and a number of young sociologists and psychologists. And it was not very easy for us architects because the people from the social sciences, they all the time said, why are you architects not interested in people? Why don't they teach you anything about people in School of Architecture? And we would say that the most important thing in life is aesthetics and proportions, and they will say, oh, you know very little. Also, I should say here that when we were taught that, we also were taught that it doesn't matter what you build because that has no influence on the life of people. The only thing which is important, if you can have, people are very adaptable, and if you can make a new flat with running water, then people will be happy forever after. That's the only thing which is really important. And then when it doesn't matter what you build, then the architecture professors could say, but only thing now which matters is the architecture, and then you should make all the details very smart. So that was, the architects were very happy about doing objects, and we thought that was great, and it doesn't matter for the people, they were happy anyway. Then I went out to do all this, and I married the psychologist, and we had all these nasty questions at our house. Why are you guys not interested in people? And in my case, I had to go back to the School of Architecture, where I started to do research on people. And I asked them, why didn't you tell me anything about people? First time I was in here. And then it dawned on me, nobody knew anything. The modernists had thrown all the old wisdom out, and the only thing we knew about was modernism. So we had to start really from square one. I had to sit on my behind for 40 or 50 years and used the tool I learned in School of Architecture, which was observing and watching. And then we expanded, my students participated, my colleagues participated. We did these students all over the world, and we did them again and again and again in other places, and we systematized them. And I just show you a couple of examples, but this was very much about the behavior of Homo sapiens in relation to architecture and city planning. Here is a nice example. This is the School of Architecture in Copenhagen had moved to a new set of buildings out in the harbor, and the dean called a very famous landscape architect and said, could you do some landscaping here? And then he did some landscaping here. And landscaping was making square lawns with edges of red iron. And in the foreground you can see a corner, and what is this corner about? That is where the students of architecture comes into the school. And what is in the background? That's where you can buy coffee. And what do students of architecture do? Do they go in right angles all the way to the coffee? No, never. They go straight. They're very energy conscious at that age. They go straight for the coffee. So 2 weeks later, the landscape architect, the famous landscape architect, was forced to come and finish his project. Now it looks like this. Another thing which we observed, it's just example, that's the edge effect. That is, if you are to stay in a place, you don't like to go out in the middle of the place. Everybody would say, what's he doing out there? He's been there now for 10 minutes. It's a very, very strange behavior. maybe we should call the police. No, you don't go out here, you go over to the edge, because at the edge, your back is covered, and you have all your senses in front of you, you can see the whole place. So we could see all over the world that people liked very much to stay along the edges, and only when they were very active, when the dog was being aired, then they had to go out in the middle, or they would stay out in the edge. You know, from a ballroom, you dance in the middle, and then you go out to the edge in the breaks, and then you hope to have a chance to dance again. They call them wallflowers in English. Then we knew that it was very, very widespread among people to like to be at edges. But then we thought maybe architects are different from ordinary people. And then we went to architecture schools in several countries and found out that architecture students behaved exactly as ordinary people. And then we started to say, if architects are like ordinary people, who designed this? And then we can ask again, who designed this? This case, I know exactly, is Daniel Libeskind in Toronto. But if you do this kind of thing and doesn't know about the edge effect, though if you forget about the edge effect, make sure to have some bronze people ready so that your square can be occupied by people, because it is contrary to human senses and people's behavior and psychology to sit in the middle of nowhere and enjoy it. Also a thing like personal space, of course, very quickly you know that man is not a touching animal, so we always keep arm's length from each other unless we have been invited to be closer. So you can see people waiting for buses the same way in Japan, in Jordan, and even in Lisboa last week. They are all standing with personal space waiting for the bus. You can see this again all over the world. In Washington Park in New York, in Times Square in Moscow, same behavior. Of course, we also were able to make high-rise buildings. And I've spent a lot of time studying high-rise buildings. I heard that Paula was a little bit happy about high-rise buildings or living high. But I could show you something here. We have, with endless number of students, we walked up in high-rise and had a crew standing down there, another one looking out from the balcony, and found out that in the first 5 stories, you are part of the city, you can follow what's going on, you can yell, and your child can hear you. But after 5 stories, you are part not of the city, but of the airline system. And the only thing you can see are some birds and see if the airline is on time. And if you are a little child in France yelling up a high-rise, "Mama!" then all the mamas look out and you cannot see which one is your mama, because we are not born to see things this way. And if mama looks out, she cannot find out which one is her child down there. So there is something about high-rise and our senses, and that the more people we move into high-rise, the more people we take out of the city. We also know they cannot see what's going on in the city. We also know they come down and participate much less than those in the lower floors. We know from experiments and from research that it's generally the 2 lower floors in all housing areas which generate 50% of all the life in the area. It's so important that it's not so complicated to get out. All these things, that was way back. I started to put them together in a book, Life Between Buildings, we heard it referred to. And it's very much about human behavior. And it is, there's a Portuguese version here with bicycles on the front page, but the interesting thing is that there's not a word about bicycles in the book, but not to worry. Much to my surprise, it was picked up in many countries because it's very basic knowledge about how Homo sapiens behave in relation to architecture and city planning. Later on, actually 40 years later, I wrote a new book. I was asked by a big foundation in Denmark, they say, couldn't you sit down and write everything you know after all these years of research while you can still remember it? And then they said, oh, I'm very busy. Then they started to take out the money and say, would you need 1 million or 2 million or 3 million? And then finally I had time. So we managed to do the book, and that book is now 15 years old, and it's come out, of course, in Portuguese, but in Brazil this time. And it's out in 40 languages at this point. And it's so widespread because there has been so little research on how Homo sapiens use the built environment. Though all these people around the world have been very hungry after knowledge, and that's why it has been spread so fast. 2 weeks ago, I wrote the contract number 40 with Azerbaijan. I never realized that they would be interested over there, but obviously they are. I've learned in my long professional life that the best thing you can do is to do research and to write books. And I wrote some 6, 7, by now 8 books, and they are out in 43 languages now. And I realized that that is the best thing you can do with your life as an architect, because in this way, you don't have to build all the projects yourself. You can change the mindset of people so that the architects and planners and engineers will think differently about city planning. And this is actually what I realize has been accomplished by making all these books in many languages. And then, of course, at a certain point, I started also to do projects. And that came about because I was sitting in School of Architecture, writing books, and then came the first mayor and said, hey, you can criticize the way we are doing it, but couldn't you come yourself and show how we should do? And then I started first in Copenhagen, then in a number of cities, and I'll come back to this a while. I did this until I retired from my firm, and they are carrying on the work now. I do some other work, but that's another story. Oh yeah, you being old as I am, it's very, very nice to think that all my 6 books are published in China. I think that's the greatest thing you can think of as an old man. What is not so pleasant is to realize that they never had time to read them over there. But maybe, I think signs that the young generation have started to read the stuff, and there has been changes made, and it was about time. Now, there's been research done for more than 50 years, and I would say that by now we know how to make fine cities for people. We have actually the tools, we know what to do, and the problem is really to have it distributed and have it used by the city governments and have their mindset changed so they think this is the way you should go. And also we have learned that this thing, as I was told in School of Architecture, that it doesn't matter what you do, that is absolutely nonsense. We form the cities, but then they form our lives. If you live in this situation or in this situation, it's 2 completely different life situations. We also found out, of course, I learned that the building, the form of the building, and the way the building comes down to the ground, and the way the space between the buildings are organized, play a fantastic role for the life, for the social life. In one case, you come out of the door and there's absolutely nothing you can do but go away. And in the other case, you came out of the door and sit in your own garden, and then the kids can see what they can do, and the grown-ups can find out. There's a fantastic difference in lifestyle. We also know that the details of the single buildings has a great influence. You have straight, sleek facades, and they signalize, go on, we don't want you here. And you have richly detailed facades which can signalize, please stay around, enjoy. Very importantly, I could tell all of you that we now know so much that we can make public spaces which are so bad that the only thing people think about when they are in these spaces is to get out. The faster, the better. So they come to this space, look around, and then they gallop out. We can also make spaces which are so nice that people can hardly drag their feet through the place because they want to sit down and enjoy. And we can make them so that people come from all over the city to stay just in that place because that has so many qualities. We made a set of quality criteria, and in the bad ones, we can see typically that out of 12 quality criteria, 12 or 13 have been overlooked. And in the good places, they are all observed. And we can find that with the same number of people coming on the same day, there will be 10 times more people having a good time on the good square or on the bad square. That's very logical, and there is actually a recipe. Now it's 2025, and we have a number of new challenges, and I'll just point to some of them, which makes use of public space even more important than previously. Of course, we have the good old human dimension that we need to meet other people personally, face to face, and we always know and have lots of evidence that people are attraction number one in the cities. So the good old public space for people is still in high demand. But now, and if you doubted that, you can just look at the way all the architects present their drawings. They're crawling with happy people, every project, even if it's a very poor project, you just pour people in, and then the mayor will think, oh, that's a nice project. All of them are out enjoying it. So it must be good. If it wasn't good, they will go home. They will gallop home as fast as they could. So it must be good. That's how we architects always draw our new projects. Look at that. But we have other demands today. We know that we have to do what we can to make a sustainable city. And we know that the more we walk and more we bicycle and the more we use public transportation, of course, that's better for the climate. The doctors tell us that a very serious problem in our communities are what they call the sitting syndrome. And we realize that for 50 years we made cities which invited people to sit in the car or sit at the office or sit all day. And it always was the idea that they will go to the fitness center and get fit, and then they can drive more. But we also realize even if we make escalators up to the fitness center, many people have good intentions, but they doesn't come there very much, and it's only a short period of life. What is needed here, the doctor, is that you organize your cities and your housing areas so that walking and bicycling is a natural part of your daily doings. If we look at the World Health Organization, they will say, please introduce policies which promote active methods of traveling, walking and bicycling. So all the doctors say, make sure that people move every day. And then we have a complete new challenge. That is that we have a very fast increasing number of elderly people in our societies. We have never had old people in the cities. They were the exception from the rule, but now they are maybe 20% of everybody who are elderly people. And the doctor tells them that you must come out every day and you must walk for half an hour, and what kind of spaces can you do this in? In many places are there no real good opportunities. So we have to take in consideration all the time that many people now are elderly, and also more people are disabled, because when you get older you get more disabled, some of them, and we have to be much more careful with that. Just as careful with the elderly as we have started to be for the children. If we look at these 4 or 5 present goals, a lively, sustainable, healthy city and a city good to be old in, you can bet that every mayor you ever know, he will say, that's my policy. That's what I want. And if you look carefully after the people in your planning, you actually will address these things. We talk very much about walkability index and whatever. So there's much talk, and some cities are doing quite a bit. But we may ask, are there cities who actually, where they do everything they can to invite people to walk and bicycle as much as possible? And there are more and more cities who are taking this course in their policies. I'll tell you very briefly about some of the cities I worked with. Melbourne. In 1985, it was a really awful city. There was absolutely nothing happening in the city center. Oops. It was empty, useless. It was called the donut, some fat stuff with nothing in the middle. And then they decided to revitalize Melbourne, and they did a fantastic job. So that if you come to Melbourne today, you will realize that it's just as nice as Paris, but the weather is better. And also, they've said in Australia, in Melbourne we walk. And if we are to walk in Melbourne, we need wide sidewalks, 8 meters all over the city. We need good granite on the sidewalk. We need trees to shade when you walk and it's hot. And we need the best street furniture in the world, and they did everything, and they even made public transportation free. So Melbourne is really changing, has really changed fantastically. It's by far the best city in the Southern Hemisphere, and if you don't know what to do, I could recommend you to move to Melbourne. I've also had the chance to work with the neighboring city of Sydney. Sydney and Melbourne, they are sort of competing, so Sydney could not come before. Most people have forgotten I also have worked in Melbourne. But then they came and whispered, could you help us to Melbourneize Sydney? And that was very complicated. In Sydney, they have a wonderful waterfront and they have a fine opera, which everybody knows, but in the city center, it was really bad. And we had a long struggle because the buses were owned by the state of New South Wales, and the street was owned by the city. City wanted the cars to go out, and state government wanted the buses to stay. They've been here for 50 years, and that's good enough. But now we have managed to clear city center of Sydney for, there were narrow streets, they were full of cars and buses and noise and pollution. Now they have a streetcar, a light rail going the length of the city. They have greenery and they are pedestrianizing their main street, 2.5 kilometers. They have introduced bicycle lanes all over. It's really a miracle. And they're doing it to make Sydney more green, better for to address the climate issue, but also to have a better city for their citizens. In New York we have worked, and you may know that one of the things we did in New York was to prove that Times Square was not really a square, it was a traffic circus. And then we were able to prove that traffic will be better in New York if they closed Broadway. So they closed Broadway, and the mayor said to the taxi drivers, "Don't worry, it's only an experiment." Half a year later, he came back and said, "Closing Broadway in Times Square, Herald Square, Union Square, and Madison Square has been the best city planning project in America for 50 years. And finally, Jane Jacobs' ideas came back to New York. And they are so happy about this, having Times Square for relaxation, that they brought in the prairies and the bisons and home on the range. Everything is there, so they can go on with developing Times Square into a wonderful place. They have made now 50 other places in New York just like Times Square, and just on asphalt, which they had taken from the motor cars. Here we are. Copenhagen, of course, has played a major part of my life. We lived in Copenhagen all the time, and already in '62 they started to humanize the city, and now they've been at it for 63 years. They took all the cars out of the main street very early. That was the same year as Jane Jacobs wrote her book in New York, and everybody said it can never work in Denmark. We are Danes, we are not Italians, it will not work with this urban life in Scandinavia, and furthermore it's too cold, it will never work. Then they took the cars out and we started to be Italians, and we have become more and more Italians every year ever since. All the squares were full of cars and parking, and all the squares have been turned into people places. All the waterfronts were parking, and all the waterfronts have been turned into people places. What was characteristic of Copenhagen was it was the first city in the world where the life of the city was carefully studied, and we were able in the university to present the city with a picture of how Copenhagen was used, and all the traffic engineers, they came with statistics to show that there were more and more cars, we should have more and more roads, and we were able to show that the more good things you made, the more people came in the city, and then the city politicians decided to make it more people-oriented and less car-oriented. And that we worked very closely between city and university for 40 years and did one big study after the other. We are doing a new one this year. We were able to show that whenever they did some square meter for the people, there were more public life in the city. And that it was really, for every 14 square meters, there was another person taking a seat. The mayor of Copenhagen, she said that without the public life research from the school, we politicians would never have dared to make Copenhagen the most livable city in the world. The politicians need data to be able to move, and they had data in Copenhagen, and now in these other cities I showed you, we always started by studying how does the city work today, how could it be improved. In Copenhagen they had two important strategies. One was they decided in the city council we will be the best city in the world for people, and also they decided we'll also be the best city in the world for bicycling, and then they set about to realize it. They've done a really fantastic job of making more and more space available for people and not for motor cars or very slow motor cars or now and then motor cars and whatever. And some examples of general strategies, because now it's not about making the city center attractive for tourists, it's about making the city better for people all over the city. So all the major cities, streets, they've changed. They were asphalt from side to side. Now there are only 2 lanes, a big lane in the middle for resting, and then they have street trees, they have bicycle lanes on either side, and sidewalks on either side. And the interesting thing is that these new streets, they are more beautiful, and they are more safe, and they can have the same number of traffic as the old streets could, because the traffic engineers, they have become more smart over the years. Another thing which is characteristic of Copenhagen is that they have this policy of continuous sidewalk. Earlier on, they had there was an usual system that when a little street went into a big street, the car could turn this way or the other way or go straight. But now they've taken the sidewalks and the bicycle lanes across all the smaller streets, and that means that my grandchildren, from when they're 6, they can go all the way, walk all the way to school, because they don't have any more to cross any streets. But some cars, some Mercedes-Benzes have to cross some sidewalks, which is a completely different story. When you're 6 years, you can be your own and walk to school yourself. That's a humanized way of organizing cities. We've also done a lot for the bicycles, and when I tried to go down to the river yesterday and walked back again, I realized I'll not talk about bicycles in Porto, but we could of course talk about it later on if you like. We have worked in very hilly cities before, but in Copenhagen we've seen that the more they made bicycle system citywide and safe, the more people use bicycle, and now about almost half of everybody going to work in Copenhagen come on bicycles. So what we learned from Copenhagen is that you get what you invite for. If you invite for more, put up more streets, there will be more traffic. But if you give better invitations for walking, for public life, and for bicycling, that is what you see growing. And what happens when you do all these dramatic things? Yeah, Copenhagen is visited by 400 delegations of mayors and city planners from all over the world every year to hear what they have done. And year after year, we see Copenhagen being listed as one of the most livable cities in the world. By Monocle this year, it was The Economist, but Copenhagen is nearly all the time among the best. And if I look at the other cities, most of them have done a lot for the people and maybe also for the bicycles. Now I could stop, but I'll not quite stop. I'll just show you this because we could just say, haha, that was fine, okay. But world is changing, and I found these 2 pictures which I think tell a fantastic story. One was a harbor in Copenhagen when I was a little boy, and the other one is a harbor today. In 1939, the harbor was a working place full of old steamers and prostitutes and drunken seamen and all kinds of stuff. And the whole city turned back. Now the whole city is trying to get down to the water, and they are using it for recreation. Complete change in my time. And if we think that there's no change in human use of the city over all these years, of course that's nonsense. The behavior is the same. We still stand at the edge and look out of the niches, but now we use other means of communication. In the good old days, we had the good old street life, and that actually was not so good necessarily. Everybody was out on the streets because they had to. They're still doing that in Bangladesh, and that was what we could see in Copenhagen 150 years ago. We know from studies that we can see 3 different ways of using public space. There are some activities which you have to do, and then there are some activities which you like to do and do when the conditions are good, and then when you're doing all this, there will be social interaction while you do this. And we also know that in the old days, quality was not important. People had to be out regardless of quality. But now most of the activities are optional, and people only use the public spaces if they're worth using. So we have to provide good quality nowadays. We have, in Copenhagen, we can see 4 different stages. The first 20 years, it was all about having space for walking. That was a period of the pedestrian streets getting the cars out of certain streets. Then, from 80 to 2000, was the time when tourism started and also people had more money. And then we started to take an interest in staying. There was a time when the cafes popped up and when the culture came to the cities. We can see that if it used to be necessary, then it was cars, then it was shopping, and from 2000 it was enjoyment mostly of what was happening in the city. If we ask the people in 1980, why are you in city? They will say, I'm in the city to shop. Why do you ask me? And if we ask 2010, why are you in the city? They will say, I'm in the city to be in the city. Why do you ask me? So the purpose of being there has changed. We see the third phase, then it starts to be activity and playgrounds, sports and activities, because the doctors have told us we shall move. And now the only thing which is really happening in Copenhagen is they make climate adaptation. Every project they do, they made it so that it will take up extra rainwater. But when there's no rainwater, it's a much better place for the people. Then there are some questions, because things are changing. Maybe there are less life on the weekdays now, and maybe leisure time activities are still a bigger and bigger proportion of what public spaces are used for, also for the Copenhageners. We can ask the question, will indirect meetings on cyberspace, will they take over the direct meetings in public space? That is a very interesting question, and I have no definite answer. We have not seen the result really of a change in way of communicating, but people are definitely looking more on the screens than on the other people nowadays. We have less direct shopping and we have more internet trade. We talk about that the shopping time has ended and we have the internet trade time or delivery time has started, and that's worldwide. And then we have what to do with the mass tourism. Tourism is fine in small doses, but if it is in great numbers, it's a really menace to culture, identity and climate. We have to do something, especially the cruise ships, because they don't help the economy a bit, and they just ruin the cities. I was asked in Copenhagen if I would do one thing to make it a better city, and I said I will put mines in the landing place of the cruise ships, so they'll blow up and stay away. We have to do something. We cannot continue with this kind of tourism. We cannot continue with this kind of flying senselessly, more and more and more. The climate cannot do it, and the cities cannot survive. Then, of course, my underlying question is the democratic public space and the meeting of citizens in public space. Is this a dream from the good old days? I would say that my work started 65 years ago with a dream of improving the good democratic public spaces for all. And it is an endless story about human values in the cities. And I must say that I strongly believe that we still need the human dimension. We need the public space where we can walk and we can meet and where we can see our fellow citizens and feel part of a community. We see all over the world that public spaces are still immensely popular. We can of course see it in Venice, but this other one is from Greenland, and I like this one very much because it's a little bit cold up there, but still that's what they do when they can do it. So now, as at any point in history, we need good public spaces for the direct meetings in our communities. And to me, it is a human right. We must fight for it and hold on to it. Thank you very much. Will there be questions now? Who will guide this? We just go back to. Of course, I covered so many subjects that there could hardly be any questions left. Maybe.
I'm waiting for the microphone. Bem, enquanto não há microfone, acho que me conseguem ouvir, não conseguem? Sim. Não estava previsto um período de perguntas e respostas, mas eu acho que ficamos todos com vontade de ouvir um bocadinho mais o professor. Portanto, se houver alguma pergunta que esteja aí latente, por favor, façam-na. Aproveitem que está aqui o professor. Está ali.
Actually, there are two microphones, one there and one there.
Okay. Thank you, Jan Gehl. It was a lovely conference, like the others that I saw in Isqueté, Lisbon. But I want to make you some question. What do you think would it be possible to do in city of Porto to be a livable city?
Livable city.
Yeah.
Because here we have so many depressions on the city, always climbing. Do you think it's possible? What do you think we can do?
Did you understand?
I'm sure that it is my general opinion that the world community will have to cut down on senseless tourism, and we will have to have fewer tourists who have spent more time and are more serious about what they're doing. And of course that's a dream. Who should do that and who dare do that? But I can see with my knowledge of cities that the cities are being ruined by all these enormous masses of people coming in droves and going in and out like this. And so I really think that we shall focus what we are doing, we shall focus on the people who live in the city. And that was also where my main focus was in this. That was the locals. And we shall not do much to make the tourists more comfortable, but make the locals have a better city. So maybe we shall look at the time when there are not so many tourists and make sure the city works well for the locals as much as possible. And then we hope that there will be some ways of curbing the mass tourism, because I really think that's a major problem. I was asked in Madrid, what do you think is the best thing about Madrid? Yeah, that's the fact that you have no harbor. So I really see this problem. We now, of course, now we are having a new situation in Scandinavia, because a lot of people from Central Europe, they come to Scandinavia to have some decent temperatures in the summer. And that is another form for tourism. But it won't solve the problem of climate and use of resources. But I do think that I've tried in my books to describe what you can do to make a better city for the local people. And that I can recommend also for Porto.
What about the fact that Porto is a hilly city?
Sorry?
What about the fact, because that was part of the question, Porto is a very hilly city with the high slopes.
I mentioned that I was not going today to talk about bicycling. I would normally talk a lot about bicycling, but I could tell you about a city in Tasmania in Australia. They have 65% of the city more or less flat and 35% hilly. And all the rich people live up in the hills. And then they decided to make a very good bicycle system on the 65%, because there was the hospitals and there was the university and whatever. And then they would say that the rich people we cannot do something about, but the other ones we can invite to bicycle. So maybe you also have a situation where you could say this district, and this district could be a good bicycle system. It has to be consistent and has to be rather safe. But all the cities I work with have New York, London, no, London not so much, but New York and Sydney and Melbourne, even Moscow, where also, I don't talk about that, but they also started with a bicycle system. I was not so sure about the weather in the winter, but they did. So the bicycling is something which many cities do a lot for. And I know from my daughter, who is a senior doctor, who will say that if elderly people do half an hour of moderate exercise every day, walk for half an hour, or bicycle for half an hour, they will, as an average, look forward to 7 extra years of lifetime and a much better quality of life in their old days. So for God's sake, make sure that people throughout their life are invited to use their own muscles. How you do it here, that's your problem.
Não sei se há mais alguém que tenha alguma pergunta. Nós aqui não conseguimos ver muito bem. Está ali, sim, ali.
Hello, thanks for the conference. You mentioned Brasilia a few times, and I was curious about it, if you ever visited Brasilia, and if there's any salvation for modernist cities like Brasilia or Chandigarh to become livable.
Brasilia, Chandigarh, it's very tough. It's very tough propositions, because they are both made. One was made by Corbusier personal, Chandigarh, and Brazil. I have a full chapter in my book about cities for people, about the Brasilia syndrome, that it looks very smart from an aeroplane, but it's not very smart to walk and to bicycle in. And actually it's also good from a helicopter, but they have not had money to give all the Brazilians a helicopter each, so they can enjoy the city from about 2 kilometers up. But down at eye level, I think Brasilia is not at all attractive. It's an architect's pipe dream. but not for ordinary people. Some people have lived there and have other, maybe are here and have other ideas, but that's their ideas.
Se houver mais alguma pergunta, podemos fazer mais uma, ou então encerrar por aqui. Eu não vejo nenhuma mão no ar. Professor, thank you very much for a very inspiring conference. And I hope this is your first of many visits to Porto.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I must walk and bicycle.